Next time, bring me something worth reading." That was what Derek Corvin said. He said it in front of his father. In front of the CFO, the head of compliance, 2 senior partners, and every analyst who had been called into the quarterly review meeting that Thursday morning. He said it the way people say things when they have never once in their lives been told no. The way someone speaks when they have mistaken their father's name for a personality. He said it, and then he picked up the glass of water sitting beside his leather portfolio binder, and he poured it. Slowly, deliberately, right onto the printed financial analysis report I had spent 11 days building. I watched the water spread across the cover page. I watched it bleed through 14 pages of financial modeling, 3 years of sourced data, and the cleanest risk-adjusted projection framework I had ever produced. The ink went blue and watery. The pages went soft and stuck together. The binding warped. Nobody in that room made a sound. Harold Corvin, Derek's father and CEO of Corvin Capital Group, was sitting at the head of the table. He looked at the wet report. He looked at his son. He looked at me. He said nothing. I was 29 years old. I had been a financial analyst at Corvin Capital for 3 years. I had a CFA designation I had passed on my first attempt while working 2 part-time jobs to cover rent. I had given those 11 days to that report body and soul. I had skipped 2 dinners with my college roommate, had brought cold coffee and dry crackers to my desk at midnight, had checked and rechecked every figure until I was certain. I was certain. And Derek Corvin poured water on it. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not give him a single thing he could use against me in that room or after it. I picked up my legal pad. I uncapped my pen. I noted the date. I noted the cost. If you want to know how a CEO's son lost millions overnight because he humiliated the wrong woman in the wrong meeting, stay with me. Like this story, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what I did after that Thursday morning was not something anyone in that room could have predicted, including me. I need to tell you who I was before that meeting, because what happened afterward only makes sense if you understand what they were trying to take. My name is Ava. I grew up in Gary, Indiana, 45 minutes from Chicago on a good day, a world apart from it in every other way. My mother worked night shifts at a regional hospital. My father sold plumbing supplies until the company folded when I was 12, and then he drove trucks. I was not raised poor in the dramatic way people sometimes romanticize. We were not desperate. We were careful. We were the family that checked prices twice, that turned lights off in empty rooms, that saved for the things we needed and went without the things we wanted. I was good with numbers from the beginning. Not in the way that gets celebrated in grade school. Not flashy fast. Not the kid who calls out answers before the teacher finishes the question. I was good with numbers the way a carpenter is good with wood. Patient, precise, respectful of the material. I understood that a figure was not just a figure. It told a story. It held history. It pointed forward. Numbers were honest in a way that people often were not. I won a partial scholarship to the University of Illinois at Chicago. I covered the rest with 2 jobs, early mornings at a campus coffee kiosk, evenings at a data entry service that I could do remotely after midnight. I graduated with a finance degree and a GPA that made my mother cry when she saw it on the paper in her hands in our kitchen in Gary. I found Corvin Capital Group during my 2nd year after graduation. I had been at a mid-size investment advisory firm that was technically fine and spiritually airless, the kind of place where no one had a bad day and no one had a good idea. Corvin Capital was different, or it appeared to be. It was headquartered in a high-rise on Wacker Drive in Chicago, 41st floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. The lobby smelled of cold marble and expensive floral arrangements. The conference rooms had real leather chairs and whiteboards that cleaned themselves. More than the aesthetics, the work was real. Corvin Capital managed institutional capital. They advised pension funds, university endowments, a handful of sovereign wealth vehicles. They handled the kind of money that, if it went wrong, people lost retirement security. If it went right, scholarship programs got funded, hospitals got equipment. That mattered to me in a way that was not abstract. I joined as a junior analyst. Within 18 months, I was mid-level. Within 3 years, I was producing the kind of independent analyses that were circulated to senior leadership. The report Derek destroyed was called the Meridian Analysis. It was the most important work I had done at Corvin Capital. Not because someone told me so, but because I knew it. I felt it the way you feel the difference between something you assembled and something you built. The Meridian product was a new structured investment vehicle Corvin Capital was preparing to recommend to their largest institutional client, Greenfield Asset Management. Greenfield managed over $8 billion of pension and endowment capital. The Meridian recommendation alone was worth $42 million in advisory fees and projected commissions. I had been assigned to the analytical support team for the Meridian launch. My job was to verify the underlying asset data and produce a risk-adjusted return projection. I did that job. I did it thoroughly. And when I was done, I found something I was not supposed to find. I want to describe the atmosphere of Corvin Capital to you, because it matters to understanding everything that came after. The 41st floor operated on a surface temperature of pleasant professionalism. People said good morning. They held doors. They said things like, great thinking, and really strong work, in meetings, even when they did not mean it, which was most of the time. There was a coffee bar with an espresso machine that cost more than my monthly rent, and someone always had a birthday cake for someone else in the first floor common area on Fridays. Underneath that surface, a precise and practiced hierarchy. Harold Corvin had built Corvin Capital over 25 years. He was smart, old school, demanding in the way that produces results, but also creates cultures where people do not speak up. His wife, Patricia Corvin, was co-founder and still sat on the board, though she was less involved day to day. She had a different quality than Harold. Sharper, quieter, watchful. When Patricia walked through the 41st floor, people adjusted without knowing they were adjusting. And then there was Derek. Derek Corvin was Vice President of Business Development. He was 32. He was tall and well-dressed and had the particular confidence of someone who had never had to earn the room he was standing in. He was good at the visible parts of the job. The client dinners, the presentations, the handshakes at conferences where he introduced himself as simply Derek Corvin and watched people rotate toward him like planets toward gravity. He was not good at the invisible parts, the work, the reading, the actual understanding of what his team produced. Which meant he needed people like me. He just did not understand why he should treat people like me with any particular care. In the 3 years before that Thursday meeting, I had watched Derek take credit for a junior analyst's fixed income report and present it to the board as his own thinking. I had watched him dismiss a colleague named Sandra's risk memo with 3 words, "Too cautious, Sandra," without reading past the executive summary. I had watched him call a vendor presentation a waste of my afternoon in front of the vendor, while his father laughed like it was a charming joke. Each time, the room absorbed it. Each time, people went quiet and went back to their desks and went on. I had my own strategy for Derek. I stayed out of his orbit as much as I could. I delivered my work to the people who needed it. I was precise in my documentation. I never gave him an angle because I never gave him much access. It was not a perfect strategy, but it had worked for 3 years, until the quarterly review meeting, until the Meridian report, until the glass of water. My desk neighbor, a project coordinator named Nora, who had worked at Corvin Capital for 7 years and knew every undercurrent in the building, had warned me once. Don't be too good at your job in a way Derek can see. He doesn't like it when women know things he doesn't. I had smiled at that and gone back to my spreadsheets. I thought I understood the politics. I thought I was managing it. I was wrong about one thing. I had underestimated how publicly he would go. After the quarterly review meeting, the room cleared the way rooms do after something uncomfortable. Quickly, quietly, people suddenly very focused on their phones and their shoes. I was the last to leave. I picked up the wet report from the table. It felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with paper. I walked to the restroom on the 41st floor. The kind of restroom that is quieter than it should be, because the tiles are real stone, and the ventilation is excellent, and the whole space is designed to make you feel composed. I stood at the sink. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was in a charcoal blazer, and I had not let one thing show on my face during that meeting, which required the kind of effort that leaves marks later when you are alone. I let myself feel it for exactly 2 minutes. Not self-pity, not fear. What I felt was clean and cold and specific. I had done excellent work, and someone had destroyed it in front of witnesses to make a point. And the point was that he could. That his name was on the building, and mine was just on the employee roster. That the room would not push back, because the room never pushed back. 2 minutes. Then the door opened. It was Nora. She was holding a paper towel folded into a neat square, which she handed to me without saying anything first. I took it. I pressed it to the back of my neck, which was warm in a way faces go when emotion is being controlled rather than expressed. Nora said, "You should have seen your face. You didn't break. Not once." I said, "I noted the date." She looked at me with an expression I had seen from her before. That quality of understanding something more precisely than you intended to communicate it. She said, "Ava, what was in that report?" I had not planned to tell anyone. I had been sitting with it alone for 5 days. The thing I had found in the meridian numbers, the specific wrongness of it, and I had been turning it over quietly. The way you turn over something fragile to look at all its sides before you decide what to do with it. But Nora had been at Corvin Capital 7 years. She knew where the walls were. She also knew me. I said, "The meridian projections have a problem." She went very still. I said, "The projected 3-month returns on the underlying asset pool do not match the asset data reports. The gap is not small. If Greenfield Asset Management invests based on those projections, they will be making a $42 million decision based on numbers that are either a serious error or something worse." Nora sat down on the small bench near the door. She looked at the floor tiles for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, "Does Derek know what was in that report?" I thought about that. I said, "I don't think he read it far enough to know." She said, "Which means he destroyed it without knowing what he was destroying." I said, "Yes." She said, "Which means the problem is still there." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ava, what are you going to do?" I looked at myself in the mirror one more time. The charcoal blazer, the composed face, the wet financial report still in my hand. I said, "I'm going to figure that out." There is a specific quality to the silence of an office building after 7 p.m. on a Thursday in October. The cleaning crew had not yet arrived. The espresso machine behind the coffee bar had powered down to its overnight standby hum. The overhead fluorescents in the main workspace had dimmed to their energy-saving setting, which cast the rows of desks in a pale blue-gray light that made the whole floor look like a photograph of itself. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was still active and lit, 41 stories below. Headlights crossing the bridge, the green and white glow of the Riverwalk, a tourist boat that had no business still being on the water in October, moving slowly south. I was the only person left on the floor. My desk was by the inner wall. No window, which was fine. I had never needed the view to concentrate. I had my laptop, my legal pad, and the backup copy I kept of every analysis file on my personal encrypted drive. I was looking at the meridian numbers again. On my desk, a glass of water. I poured it myself from the small, filtered pitcher I kept in my bottom drawer. A habit from my coffee kiosk days when staying hydrated was the only reliable way to get through a closing shift. I wrapped both hands around the glass and looked at the spreadsheet. The numbers looked back at me. The Meridian structured product was a custom-designed investment vehicle. At its core, it was a bundle. A portfolio of mid-market commercial real estate loans, blended with a tranche of equipment leasing receivables from 3 mid-size manufacturing companies, wrapped in a structured note. Corvin Capital's proposition to Greenfield Asset Management was that this bundle, properly managed, would return 7.8% annualized over the first 3 years. 7.8% was a strong number. It was the kind of number that made pension fund managers lean forward. The problem was in the underlying asset data. The commercial real estate loan pool had been assembled from assets supplied by a third-party originator called Tanner Bridge Capital. The asset data report from Tanner Bridge, which I had obtained through our data vendor relationships, showed an average loan-to-value ratio that did not match what the Meridian modeling was using. The Meridian model was using a ratio that implied the assets were healthier, lower risk, than the Tanner Bridge data actually showed. The difference, when run through the projection model, meant that the 7.8% return figure was overstated. The real number, using accurate inputs, was closer to 5.1. 2.7 percentage points on a $42 million investment is not a rounding error. I had flagged this in the report. Page 7, clearly annotated. I had also noted that I could not determine from my position whether the discrepancy was an error on the modeling team's part, or whether the Tanner Bridge data being used in the model had been selectively adjusted. Either way, the figure Greenfield was going to see was wrong. Derek had poured water on page 7. I stared at the glass in my hands. I thought about what selectively adjusted meant in regulatory terms. I thought about what it meant for Greenfield's pension beneficiaries, the teachers, the municipal workers, the retirees whose savings were a line item in Greenfield's portfolio. I thought about what it meant for me if I stayed quiet. My name was on the Meridian Analytical Support Team. When this product failed, and with accurate numbers it would underperform significantly and there would be questions, no one was going to say the Vice President of Business Development made the call. They were going to look at the analysts. I thought about what it meant if I did not stay quiet. I set the glass down. I opened a new folder on my encrypted drive. I labeled it Meridian Documentation. I began. There is a difference between discovering a problem and understanding what kind of problem it is. Over the next 4 days, I went back through every version of the Meridian model I could access through our internal systems. I had legitimate analyst access to the shared project drive. I used it methodically, documenting each version I pulled, the timestamp on each file, the change history. In financial systems, change histories are automatic. I did not alter anything. I simply read. What I found across the version history was a pattern. The first version of the Meridian model, dated 8 weeks prior, used the Tanner Bridge asset data as I had seen it, the actual loan-to-value ratios as reported. The projected return in that version was 5.3%. The second version, dated 6 weeks prior, showed a manual override in the asset quality inputs. Someone had adjusted the loan-to-value ratios used in the model. The projected return jumped to 6.9%. The third version, the current version, the one that would be presented to Greenfield, showed a second adjustment. The return was now 7.8%. The Tanner Bridge inputs, compared to the actual Tanner Bridge data report, had been smoothed in both versions, a careful, incremental change that would not look dramatic if you only saw the latest version. You had to look at the progression to see it for what it was. I sat with that for a long time. A person can make one modeling error. A person does not make 3 progressively aligned adjustments in the same direction by accident. I thought about the word fraud. I did not like it. Fraud was a legal conclusion, not an analytical one, and I was an analyst, and my job was to describe what the data showed. What the data showed was, the numbers in the Meridian model had been changed from accurate to inaccurate in 3 deliberate steps. The beneficiary of those changes was a more impressive return figure. The audience for that return figure was Greenfield Asset Management. I printed nothing. I exported nothing to any personal location that could later be questioned. I documented my findings in a memo saved only to my encrypted drive and dated with a timestamp. I wrote it in the same register I used for all professional documentation. Precise, plain, factual, without attribution of intent. The memo described what I found. It described the version history. It compared the model inputs to the source data. It made no conclusions about motive. It was 19 pages long. Then I took the proper step. I tried to bring it to someone. I sent an email to Derek Corvin's executive assistant, requesting a follow-up meeting on the Meridian analytical findings. I received a reply the next morning. Derek's schedule is fully committed through the launch preparation period. If you have supporting documentation, please add it to the Meridian shared drive for the team's reference. I added a brief summary memo to the shared drive. It disappeared from the drive within 4 hours with no record of where it went. I submitted a request through the compliance intake portal for a preliminary review meeting regarding a concern on an active product. The automated response said my request had been received and I would be contacted within 5 to 7 business days. 6 business days later, no contact. I sent a follow-up to the compliance team directly. I received a response from a senior compliance officer named Gary, whose tone was the professional equivalent of a door being politely but firmly shut. Hi Ava, thanks for the note. I've checked with leadership and been informed the Meridian product has completed senior review and received approval from the VP of Business Development. Let me know if there's anything else I can help with. I stared at Gary's email. I read it 3 times. Approved from the VP of Business Development. Derek had signed off, which meant either Derek knew what was in the model and approved it anyway, or Derek had not read the model at all and simply rubber-stamped it. Given that he had also not read the report I produced reviewing it, neither option was comforting. The channels were closed. Internal escalation was not going to work. I thought about what that meant for a long moment. I poured another glass of water. I looked at it. I thought about the word whistleblower. I first met Marcus Holt at a CFA Institute regional conference in Milwaukee 2 years prior. I was attending on Corvin Capital's behalf to represent the firm at a roundtable on structured credit products. Marcus was not presenting. He was in the audience, which surprised me because he had recently stepped down as CFO of a major Midwest asset manager and could have had a speaker slot simply by asking. He sat in the 3rd row and took notes in a small green notebook with a mechanical pencil. I noticed both the notebook and the pencil because I also brought a notebook and a mechanical pencil, and it is the kind of thing you notice. We ended up at the same table at the conference lunch, one of those open seating situations where neither of us was especially motivated to seek out a table of strangers, and we both independently gravitated to the one with 2 empty seats at the edge of the room. We talked about the panel, about the roundtable topic, about structured credit risk in general. He was the kind of person who listened without performing listening. No every few seconds, no reflexive nodding. He just looked at you and heard you. Before the lunch ended, he gave me his card. He said, "If you ever run into a situation where you need someone to think out loud with, I'm a reasonably useful sounding board." I had kept the card. I had never used it. I called him on a Wednesday in October, 3 weeks before the Greenfield pitch. I said I had a hypothetical situation I wanted to get his perspective on. He said he had time on Friday morning. We met at a coffee shop in the West Loop, not a Corvin Capital affiliated space, not anywhere near the 41st floor. He was exactly as I remembered. Green notebook, mechanical pencil. He ordered drip coffee and did not add anything to it. I described the situation as a hypothetical. An analyst at a financial advisory firm, a structured product, a version history showing progressive adjustments to inputs, an institutional client with pension exposure. Internal channels tried and closed. He listened. He did not say anything until I finished. Then he said, hypothetically, the person who discovers something like this faces a specific fork. They can be a witness, meaning they document, they preserve, and they wait to see if it surfaces on its own. Or they can be a whistleblower, meaning they take the documented concern to an external authority before the harm occurs. He folded his hands on the table. He said, the difference matters both ethically and practically. A witness can claim they tried the internal channels. A whistleblower takes an active step that creates exposure, professional and sometimes personal, but also creates protection. The SEC's whistleblower program provides legal protection and potential financial protection to people who report securities violations. The Dodd-Frank provisions are specific. If the hypothetical person has documentation, they are in a better position than they might think. I said, and the institutional client in this hypothetical? Is there value in them knowing directly? He looked at me for a moment. He said, that depends on whether the hypothetical person has any connection to someone at the institutional client who has the standing to act on the information. I said, the hypothetical person doesn't. He said, I might know someone. He opened his green notebook. He wrote 2 things on a page and tore it out and slid it across the table. A name, a title, and an email address at the SEC's regional office in Chicago. Below it, another name, a title, and a Greenfield Asset Management Board contact. He said, I'm going to pretend we talked about your vacation plans today. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. I said, Marcus, why are you helping me? He picked up his coffee. He said, because I once sat on information I should have reported, and I watched someone lose their retirement savings because I weighed my own career against their security, and I made the wrong calculation. I have been correcting for that for 15 years. He took a drink. This is part of the correction. I want to be honest about what those next 2 weeks cost me. In the financial world, the concept of sunk cost is something analysts talk about constantly. A sunk cost is a cost already incurred, an investment already made that cannot be recovered regardless of what decision you make going forward. The principle is, do not let sunk costs drive future decisions. The money is already gone. The question is only what the correct next action is. I had a sunk cost. 3 years at Corvin Capital, the relationships, the understanding of the systems, the reputation I had built brick by brick from the first day I walked into the marble lobby with a laptop bag and a CFA study guide, and told myself this was the beginning of something. 3 years of proving I belonged in rooms I had not been born into. 3 years of arriving early and staying late and producing work I was genuinely proud of. If I went forward, if I sent the documentation to the SEC to Marcus's Greenfield contact, I was likely burning all of it. Whatever happened to Derek, whatever happened to Corvin Capital, it would be known that the analyst who flagged it was me. In industries like this one, the people who blow the whistle are not rewarded for being right. They are noted for being difficult, for being threats, for being the kind of person you do not hire for the next senior role because you are not sure whose side they will end up on. I knew all of this. I sat with all of it for 2 weeks. Nora asked me once during those 2 weeks what I was thinking about. I told her I was running a cost-benefit analysis on a major decision. She said, "Is this the Meridian thing?" I said yes. She said, "Ava, I want you to do something for me. Forget the cost-benefit for a second. Just tell me, what happens if you do nothing?" I said, "The product goes to market. Greenfield invests $42 million based on projections that overstate real returns by 2.7 percentage points. When the product underperforms, and it will, pension fund beneficiaries absorb the shortfall. Greenfield's trust in the market is damaged. The analysts on the team, including me, are associated with a product that failed." Nora said, "And what happens to Derek?" I said, "In that scenario, probably nothing. He's VP of Business Development with his father's name on the building. He'll reframe it as market volatility. He'll find someone else to point at." Nora said quietly, "And the version where you do something?" I thought about the version where I did something. I said, "Derek Corvin loses everything he didn't earn." She said, "Ava, you already know what you're going to do. You're just scared to admit it." I looked at my hands on the table. I thought about that. She was right. I had known from the moment I read that version history what I was going to do. Because there was no version of myself that could look at those numbers, at the gap between what was true and what was being told to people whose retirement security depended on it, and choose to look away. Not because I was brave, because I was a financial analyst, and the thing I believed about numbers was that they had to be honest. A number that lied was not a number. It was a weapon. Derek had poured water on my work. He had tried to make me feel the cost of being right. He had made an error in judgment. The sunk cost was already paid. The question was only what the correct next action was. I went back to my desk. I opened the Meridian documentation folder on my encrypted drive. I started building the packet. Building a documentation packet for a potential regulatory submission is not the same as building a revenge plan. I want to be clear about that, not to protect myself in hindsight, but because the distinction mattered to how I did it and what it ultimately showed. A revenge plan is emotional. It is built to wound. It is organized around what will hurt most. What I built was a record of facts. I worked on it over 9 days, in the early mornings before anyone arrived at the office, and in the late evenings after the floor emptied. I used my legitimate analyst access throughout. I pulled nothing I was not authorized to access. I documented every pull, time-stamped, purpose-notated, access method, recorded in a separate log I kept on my encrypted drive alongside the main documentation folder. The packet had 5 sections. Section 1, the source data. The Tanner Bridge Capital Asset Data Report as originally provided through our data vendor relationships. The original loan-to-value ratios, as reported. Section 2, the model version history. The 3 versions of the Meridian projection model, pulled from the legitimate shared project drive with timestamp documentation. The input changes annotated side by side, what the source data showed, what the model used, the difference in each step. Section 3, the impact analysis. My own analytical work, the clean version, the accurate version, the one I had originally produced in the report that was destroyed. Projected returns using actual inputs, 5.1% versus the presented 7.8%. Impact on a $42 million investment over the stated 3-year projection period. Expressed in plain figures, not in arguments. Section 4, the internal communication record. My email to Derek's executive assistant. The summary memo I uploaded to the shared drive and the documented evidence of its disappearance. My compliance intake submission. Gary's response. Section 5, context documents. The Greenfield pitch materials as I had access to them through the shared drive. The product summary sheet. The timeline for the Greenfield presentation. The packet was 19 pages of documentation plus 26 exhibit files. I did not write a cover letter that said Derek Corvin was a fraud. I did not include my personal impressions of what had been done and why. Cover letters that said things like that invited questions about the reporter's motive rather than questions about the reported conduct. I wrote a 2-paragraph transmittal that said, "I am a financial analyst at Corvin Capital Group. I am submitting the attached documentation regarding a discrepancy I identified between the source asset data and the model inputs used in the Meridian structured product, currently in preparation for presentation to Greenfield Asset Management. I have exhausted internal reporting channels. I am submitting this documentation pursuant to the SEC Whistleblower Program under Section 21F of the Exchange Act." That was it. I read the transmittal letter 4 times. It was correct, it was factual, it was complete. On the 9th day of the project, I also did something I had not initially planned. I sent a separate, shorter summary document to Marcus's Greenfield board contact. Not the full packet, that went to the SEC. The Greenfield summary was a 4-page document describing the projection discrepancy in plain language, with a reference to the comparative figures and the note that a formal disclosure had been made to regulatory authorities. The purpose was not to embarrass Corvin Capital. The purpose was to ensure that Greenfield had the information they needed before Monday's pitch to make their own decision. I believed they had the right to know. I drafted the communications. I did not send them yet. I held them for 3 more days. The email came on a Wednesday morning. I was at my desk, early, a cup of coffee from the machine in the break room, going warm beside my mousepad. The floor was not yet full, a scatter of early arrivals, the administrative side of the team, one analyst who I knew commuted from the suburbs and started early to beat traffic. The email came from Derek Corvin, addressed to the entire analyst pool and the full leadership team. Subject line: Meridian Launch, Updated Risk Framework Overview. I opened it. My coffee went cold while I read. The email described in 37 lines what Derek called his risk-adjusted approach to the Meridian product recommendation. He cited 3 specific analytical decisions. All 3 of them were from the report I had produced, the one he had poured water on, described in terms that were close enough to my original language to be recognizable, but reframed throughout as his own strategic thinking. He did not mention my name. He did not mention the analytical team. He positioned himself as the architect of the methodology. At the bottom of the email, a note that the Meridian Greenfield pitch was confirmed for Monday. He had included a revised summary deck as an attachment. I opened the attachment. My figures, my presentation structure, my risk notation framework, no attribution. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Very slowly, very precisely. I saved the email. I opened my documentation folder. I added Derek's email and the revised deck as Section 6 of the packet. Then I opened a new email window. I addressed it to the SEC regional contact. I attached the packet. I addressed a second email to the Greenfield board member. I attached the 4-page summary. I addressed a third email. Patricia Corvin. Marcus had not suggested this. I had not planned it initially. But Derek's email changed my assessment. Patricia was a co-founder. She was a board member. She had a legal and fiduciary exposure that was not the same as Harold's. Harold was CEO, primarily operational. Patricia's board role created a governance responsibility. More relevantly, I had watched Patricia walk the 41st floor. I had watched the way she noticed things. She was not a woman who was ignorant of what her son did. She was a woman who had made a series of choices about what to act on. I was offering her the choice to act before external authorities acted for her. I wrote Patricia's email carefully. It was respectful. It was brief. It stated that I was sharing documentation that had also been submitted to the SEC and shared with a Greenfield board representative, and that I believed the co-founder and board should have the opportunity to review the findings before the Monday presentation if they chose to take action. I held the 3 emails in draft for 24 hours. Then it was Friday evening. The floor had emptied. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The city was still lit outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The overhead lights had dimmed to their blue-gray energy-saving glow. I opened my bottom drawer. I poured water from the filtered pitcher into a glass. I held the glass in both hands. I looked at it for a moment. Just the glass? Just the water? Just the stillness of the empty floor. I thought about Derek's face in that meeting room, the casual contempt of it, the certainty that what he destroyed would stay destroyed. I thought about Nora in the restroom. You didn't break, not once. I thought about Marcus. I once sat on information I should have reported. I thought about the pension fund beneficiaries, the teachers, the municipal workers, the retirees who were a line item in a portfolio being managed with numbers that were not true. I set the glass down on the desk. I opened my email. I pressed send on all three. Then I closed my laptop. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. I turned off the desk lamp. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the lobby button. I went home. I did not sleep well. That is the honest thing to say. I lay in my apartment in Pilsen, a one-bedroom I had moved into 6 months prior, when I finally had enough saved to stop sharing walls with 4 other people. And I listened to the sounds of the street outside and thought about everything that could go wrong. I thought about whether the SEC contact would take the submission seriously. I thought about whether the Greenfield board member would act on the summary or pass it to legal, who would pass it back to Corvin Capital, who would warn Derek, who would do something I had not anticipated. I thought about whether Patricia Corvin would call Harold at 8 p.m. on a Friday night and trigger something that reached me before Monday morning. I thought about what Monday morning would look like if none of it worked. If I walked onto the 41st floor and Derek was there and the meridian pitch was proceeding and nothing had changed. I thought about what I would do in that case. I thought I would go to my desk. I would continue my work. I would document that I had tried. And then I would start looking for another job. I was honest with myself about that. The outcome I could control was my own conduct. The outcome I could not control was what other people did with a true thing once it was given to them. I fell asleep somewhere after 2 a.m. My alarm went off at 6:30. Saturday. I made coffee. I made eggs. I sat at my kitchen table with the weekend crossword. I do the crossword in pen, which is the one low-stakes point of pride I allow myself, and I waited. I did not have to wait as long as I expected. On Saturday afternoon, a message came through Marcus. He did not email. He called. I answered on the second ring because I was sitting 3 feet from my phone. He said, "The Greenfield contact received the summary. He took it to the risk committee last night. They are not attending Monday's presentation." He paused. "He also wants to know if you are open to a call next week." I said, "Yes." Marcus said, "There's something else. The co-founder, Patricia Corvin, the person you reached out to, she apparently responded." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I don't know the specifics, but I was told there was a board call this morning." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The crossword was still open in front of me. I had not filled in a single square. I thought about Patricia Corvin, about the way she walked the 41st floor, about the choices she had made over the years about what to notice and what to act on. I thought about the board's call on a Saturday morning. I thought about what that meant for Harold Corvin, for Derek. I thought, the machine has started. I did not know how far it would go. I did not know what Monday morning would bring. But I had loosed something that had its own momentum now. A fact in motion, a true thing moving toward the people who needed to hold it. And that was both relieving and quietly terrifying in the way that any irreversible action is. I made another cup of coffee. I finished half of it. I picked up the crossword pen. I filled in 7 across. The clue was financial risk word. 6 letters, starting with F. I wrote, fraud. Then I put the pen down and looked at the kitchen window and breathed slowly until I felt the right kind of calm. Not the absence of feeling, but the presence of clarity. The cost-benefit had been run. The decision had been made. The only thing left was to walk back into the building on Monday and take what came. Monday morning, October. Chicago in October has a specific quality of cold. Not the deep cold of January that is simply brutal, but a cold that has personality. It comes off the lake sideways. It has an edge to it. It reminds you that summer was a temporary arrangement and the city's natural state is something considerably less forgiving. I wore my best blazer. Gray wool, structured shoulders, double-breasted. I wore it on days when I needed to feel like myself at full resolution. I took the blue line to Clark and Lake, walked 2 blocks north, entered the glass revolving door of the Corvin Capitol building. The lobby was cool and smelled of fresh flowers. The security guard nodded. I pressed the elevator button for 41. I arrived at 8:45, earlier than most. By 9:15, the floor had filled to its normal Monday activity level. People at desks, keyboards, the low music of the espresso machine running. No sign that anything was different. I answered 2 emails. I updated a spreadsheet for an unrelated project. I drank my coffee. At 10:02, my desk phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. A woman said, "This is Sarah Ewan. I'm with the legal team at Greenfield Asset Management. I'm following up on documentation we received Friday evening regarding the Meridian product. I wanted to confirm that the materials came from you and that you'd be available for a conversation with our team if needed." I said, "Yes, you may reach me at this number or by email." She said, "Thank you. Our team will be in touch." She hung up. I set the phone down. I went back to my spreadsheet. My hands were steady. At 10:58, an email notification appeared in my inbox. It was from the company calendar system. The Monday morning Greenfield pitch meeting, previously listed from 2 to 4 p.m. on the conference room calendar I could see, had been canceled. Reason listed, logistics. No further information. At 11:30, 3 people from the compliance team passed through the open floor space toward Harold Corvin's corner office. They went in. The glass door closed behind them. Through the frosted glass, I could see the shapes of them sitting, standing, Harold at his desk. Derek Corvin had not come in. I know this because his office, which was on the south side of the floor, glass-fronted, was empty. Lights off, screen dark. His assistant's desk, outside his office, had his assistant, but not him. Nora appeared at the edge of my desk at noon. She crouched down so she was below eye level, a precaution, so that if anyone looked at us, they would see a coordinator checking in with an analyst, not 2 people exchanging anything significant. She said quietly, "Something is happening." I said, "I know." She looked at me. She said, "You did it." I said, "The compliance people are in Harold's office. That doesn't mean it's done." She said, "I know, but you did it." She stood up smoothly, picked up the folder she had been carrying as props, and walked back toward the project coordination desk. I turned back to my screen. I felt, very distantly, something move in my chest. Not pride, not relief, not satisfaction. Something quieter than any of those. Something like, accurate. Something like, I did not lie when the lie would have been easier. Something like, the work held. By end of day Monday, the information that Greenfield had withdrawn from the Meridian presentation had circulated enough that the senior analysts had heard it. Nobody said anything outright. They were all professionals, and professionals do not speculate aloud in the open floor. But I could feel the quality of the silence change in the way you feel weather change before the actual weather arrives. Derek did not come in on Tuesday either. By Tuesday afternoon, the internal compliance team had expanded their inquiry. I know this because I received a formal email from the chief compliance officer, not Gary, not his assistant, but the CCO directly, requesting all documentation I had produced related to the Meridian project in my official capacity as an analytical team member. I forwarded everything from my work files immediately and acknowledged receipt. Tuesday evening, a financial newswire, not major, a mid-tier industry service that tracked institutional capital flows, ran a brief item noting that Greenfield Asset Management had declined to participate in a structured product offering from Corvin Capital Group pending clarification of a methodology discrepancy. The item was 4 paragraphs. It was enough. Corvin Capital had 2 publicly traded subsidiaries, a real estate investment trust they managed and a publicly listed fixed income fund. By Wednesday morning, institutional investors who followed Corvin Capital's advisory reputation had begun adjusting positions. The REIT dropped 2.4% by noon. The fixed income fund dropped 1.8%. Small percentages, large dollar amounts at institutional scale. I tracked the numbers from my desk because tracking securities data was part of my job and no one could fault me for it. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. I felt the same crystalline clarity I feel when a calculation resolves and the answer is correct. A true number landing in the right place. What I was watching on my screen was the market's response to a truth it had been denied. The $42 million Corvin Capital had expected from the Greenfield relationship was gone. The revenue projections Derek had built his quarterly presentation around, gone. The market cap of the 2 subsidiaries was declining in real time, as investors recalibrated what Corvin Capital's reputation was actually worth without the Greenfield anchor. By Wednesday afternoon, the total loss across direct revenue, subsidiary market cap erosion, and projected fee income for the quarter was, by my conservative estimate, in the millions. Multiple millions. I did not write that number down. I did not need to. On Wednesday at 2:17 p.m., Derek Corvin was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. This was communicated through a brief staff email from the Human Resources Director. No reason given, no timeline specified. At 3:40, I was called to Harold Corvin's office. Harold Corvin's office had the kind of gravity that corner offices in tall buildings always have. The accumulated weight of decisions made there, the physical presence of a man who had sat at that desk for 25 years and shaped a company from it. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. The river visible below, gunmetal in the October light. Real bookshelves, not for show, actual books he had actually read judging by the state of them. He was behind his desk. 2 people from legal were in chairs to his left. A woman I recognized as one of the senior compliance officers sat to his right with a laptop. Harold looked tired. Not the managed tiredness of a busy CEO who performs exhaustion for effect. Actually tired, the kind that sits behind the eyes and is not cosmetic. He said, "Ava, sit down." I sat. He said, "You submitted documentation to the SEC and to Greenfield Asset Management regarding the Meridian product." Not a question. I said, "Yes." He said, "Did you attempt internal escalation first?" I said, "Yes." I placed a single page on his desk, the summary of my email to Derek's assistant, my shared drive upload, my compliance intake submission, and Gary's response. I had printed it that morning. I had been prepared to be called in. Harold looked at the page without picking it up. He looked at it for a long time. One of the legal people started to say something, and Harold held up one hand slightly. Just a degree of motion, barely a lift. And the legal person stopped. Harold said, "Why didn't you come to me directly?" I said, "I went through the channels that exist for this purpose, sir. They closed. If I had gone around them to the CEO directly, I would have been bypassing every internal structure the company has established. I paused. And honestly, I was not confident the result would have been different. The room was very quiet. The air conditioning ran. The river was gray outside the windows. Harold said, "The report, the one that was..." He stopped. He tried again. "The report from the quarterly review." I said, "The meridian analysis." "Yes, I have a preserved copy. I kept one." He said, "Was everything in the public submission consistent with what you found independently?" I said, "It was the same work. The version that was submitted to the SEC was more organized, more fully documented, and 14 pages longer. But the core finding was identical to what was in the original report." Harold's hands were flat on the desk. Large hands, older. He looked at them. He looked at the page I had placed in front of him. He looked at the window. He said, "Thank you, Ava. That will be all for now." I stood. I picked up nothing from his desk. There was nothing to pick up. I walked to the door. I had my hand on the handle when Harold said, without turning, "I'm sorry. For the meeting. For what happened in that room." I thought about what to say. There were several things I could have said. I said, "I documented the cost." Then I opened the door and walked back onto the floor. The call from Corvin Capital's legal team came on Thursday. It was a partner from their outside counsel, polished, careful, the kind of attorney who presents reasonableness as a professional courtesy before you realize what's being offered to you. He said the company was taking the matter seriously. He said they were grateful for Ava's commitment to accuracy and compliance. He said those exact words: gratitude, commitment, accuracy, compliance. Then he said the company would like to discuss an arrangement that recognized her contribution and allowed all parties to move forward constructively. He mentioned a promotion to senior analyst with an immediate salary adjustment. He mentioned a seat on the Meridian Review Committee, which was being restructured. He mentioned a one-time settlement figure if she was willing to sign a broad non-disclosure agreement covering her experiences at Corvin Capital. I let him finish. I let the silence sit for a moment after he finished. Then I said, "I appreciate the call. I've retained my own counsel, and I'll have her review any written offer you'd like to make. For now, any communication should go through her directly." I gave him my attorney's name and number. My attorney was a woman named Clara Brandt, who specialized in employment law and securities whistleblower cases, and who I had hired, on Marcus's recommendation, 7 days earlier. The legal partner's tone shifted fractionally. He said, "Of course." He said they looked forward to a productive conversation with my counsel. He said best wishes. He hung up. I held the phone for a moment. I thought about the word contribution. The thing I had contributed was an accurate number. The thing they wanted to buy my silence about was an inaccurate one. The offer was essentially, "Here is money for the difference between what was true and what we wished were true." I put the phone down. I picked up my bag. I put on my gray wool blazer. I took the elevator to the lobby. I walked through the marble floor. I pushed through the glass revolving door into the October air off the lake, sideways and edged and completely honest. I did not look back at the building. I walked 2 blocks north to where a coffee shop I had always liked, but never had time to sit in properly, had a corner table open near the window. I sat down. I ordered a coffee. I pulled out a fresh legal pad. I wrote 3 words at the top of the first page. What comes next? Then I started writing. Not a cost-benefit analysis, not a risk assessment framework. Something simpler. What I knew, what I was good at, what I wanted to build if I got to choose. I had spent 3 years inside a system that was supposed to be built on the principle that numbers are honest. I was good at financial analysis. I was good at finding the truth in data. I was good at communicating what I found in ways that non-analysts could act on. I was not good at pretending I had not found what I found. What if I stopped pretending I needed to be inside someone else's institution to do that work? I wrote for 2 hours. The coffee went cold. I ordered another one. By the time I left the coffee shop, I had a 2-page sketch of something that did not exist yet. A transparency auditing and financial consulting firm. Independent. Built on the principle that an institutional investor's greatest risk is not market volatility. It is bad information. I thought about who I would want beside me. I thought about Marcus. I thought about Nora. I thought about the Greenfield board member who had taken a summary document seriously on a Friday night. I thought about what I would call it. I thought, Meridian. Not the product, not Corvin's version. The word itself, from Latin, referring to the highest point the sun reaches in its arc across the sky. The moment of full clarity. The moment when there are no shadows at all. Meridian Truth Consulting. I folded the legal pad pages into my bag. I walked to the blue line. I wrote it home. 2 months passed. I want to give that time its weight, not skip it, not compress it into a sentence. 2 months is not nothing. It is 8 weeks. It is time in which you sleep badly some nights and soundly on others. It is time in which you have mornings where the clarity of the decision you made feels like something warm and solid, and mornings where you sit at your kitchen table with your coffee and think, what if I had just been quiet? What if I had let the numbers be what they were told to be? What if I had chosen the easier version? It is time in which you learn whether the choice you made was the beginning of something or the end of it. In those 2 months, the SEC's inquiry into Corvin Capital became public. It was not explosive news. A regulatory inquiry in financial services rarely is the first stage of it. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was visible to anyone who tracked institutional advisory firms. Derek Corvin's administrative leave became permanent. His title disappeared from the company website. His LinkedIn profile, which I looked at once and will not pretend I did not, went from VP of Business Development to blank. The SEC whistleblower program, pursuant to Dodd-Frank, protected me from retaliation and also, after Clara Brandt filed the relevant paperwork, provided a statutory protection that made it considerably more complicated for Corvin Capital to pursue any action against me. They withdrew the NDA offer. They did not pursue anything further. I was told, through Clara, that Patricia Corvin had personally made the decision not to pursue, and had also made a quiet decision about certain other things relating to how Corvin Capital had been managed in the business development division. I thought about Patricia Corvin sometimes, about what it costs to be a mother who has watched her child do something like this, who has had the choice between the institution and the truth arrive in her inbox on a Friday night. I did not know what she had felt. I knew what she had chosen. I chose to respect that without knowing the full price she paid for it. Marcus became the co-founder and chair of Meridian Truth Consulting. He brought his green notebook to our first meeting in the office space we had rented, a smaller building in the West Loop, not a high-rise, a place with wide windows and exposed brick and a conference room that smelled of fresh coffee and old wood rather than cold marble and expensive floral arrangements. Nora gave Corvin Capital her notice and joined us as director of operations. The day she walked into the new office with her own coffee mug and set it on her desk, I felt something I did not have a financial term for. I felt it as a small warmth in the center of my chest that was not calculation and not strategy. It was something closer to being known. The Greenfield board member, a man named Howard Pierce, who had been at Greenfield for 22 years and had a reputation for doing the boring, essential work of actually reading what he was sent us a referral. Our first client, a pension fund management organization in the Midwest that wanted an independent audit of their investment product due diligence process. It was exactly the work we had built Meridian Truth to do. I was 30 years old. I had no name on any building. I had my legal pad, my mechanical pencil, my encrypted drive with its months of careful documentation, and a 2-room office on the West Loop with 2 people I trusted absolutely. I had also, per the SEC whistleblower program regulations, filed for potential financial recognition of the disclosure. The SEC's whistleblower awards, under Dodd-Frank, range from 10 to 30% of sanctions collected above $1 million in cases where the disclosure leads to enforcement. Clara told me not to expect anything quickly. These things moved on regulatory timelines, not human timelines. She also told me the Meridian case, based on what had been submitted and what the inquiry was developing, was substantive. I noted that as a potential asset. I invested my energy in the work I could build today. I said earlier that I would tell you about the launch party for Meridian Truth Consulting. It was held on a Thursday evening in November, in a rented event space in River North, a neighborhood in Chicago that is not trying to be anything in particular, and therefore feels more real than the neighborhoods that are. The space had exposed brick on one wall and tall windows on the other, and warm Edison bulb light strung across the ceiling. It was not extravagant. It was honest, which was the quality I most wanted the company to project. There were about 40 people there. Marcus, Nora, Clara Brandt and her husband, Howard Pierce, who had driven up from Indianapolis for the occasion, a handful of analysts and finance professionals I had come to know over the years at various conferences and industry events. My mother, Anne, who had driven in from Gary in her good coat, and who spent most of the evening being introduced by Marcus as the reason Ava knows how to calculate a sunk cost and keep moving. My mother cried twice. The second time was when Howard Pierce gave a brief welcome toast and mentioned that the reason Meridian Truth Consulting existed was because one analyst with access to accurate numbers had decided that accurate numbers mattered more than her own safety. My mother, beside me, gripped my elbow and said quietly, "That's right. I do not drink alcohol at company events. It is the kind of precision image decision I make for myself. I want the version of me that runs a company to be the version that stays fully present at all times, and that means water. I carry it without explanation. People at these events are practiced enough not to remark on it." I had a glass of water. I was standing near the window that looked out over the River North Street, which in November was quiet the way Chicago streets go quiet when the cold comes back. Fewer pedestrians, more headlights, the sidewalk empty enough that you could hear the sound of it. Nora came to stand beside me. She had a glass of the white wine they were serving. She looked at the room. She looked at me. I looked at the glass in my hand. The water. The clean, plain, non-negotiable truthfulness of it. I thought about October, about the quarterly review meeting, about the sound of a glass of water being poured slowly and deliberately over pages I had built with 11 days of honest work, about the silence of the room, about the way Harold Corvin had looked at his son and looked at me and said nothing. I thought about my desk at midnight, the pale blue-gray light, another glass of water held in both hands, looking at numbers that refused to lie even when other people needed them to. I thought about the email drafts open on my screen, the send button, the irreversible step forward. I raised the glass, not to the room, not for a toast. I just raised it quietly, the way you raise something to mark a moment you want to carry with you. Nora, beside me, understood. She raised her glass of wine without being told to. I said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "To the man who made this possible." She said softly, "May he reflect on the exact cost-benefit ratio of pouring water on the wrong person's work." I looked at the room. Marcus, at the center of it, talking to Howard Pierce. My mother near the food table, laughing at something one of the junior analysts had said. The Edison bulbs warm overhead. The city through the windows, cold and indifferent and exactly as it always was. Not friendly, not cruel, just there, with all its numbers and all its truths and all its possibilities for people willing to do the work accurately. I breathed. I felt correct. I felt built from the right materials. I felt the thing I had been told you would feel when you stopped waiting for the institution to be what you needed it to be and became your own institution instead. I felt, this is worth more than what he tried to take. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt like something you needed to hear today, I want you to leave a comment below and tell me what it was. Every comment matters to this channel, and it helps more people who need this story find it. Like this video if Ava's story moved you. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Share it with someone who is sitting somewhere right now, holding the truth in their hands, trying to decide whether it's worth it. It is worth it. The numbers don't lie, and neither do you.